Welcome to this Music Excellence London webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Stephen Berryman, Director of Music at the City of London School for Girls, and with me is Philip Cashin, Head of Composition at the Royal Academy of Music. Before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see us, but you should be able to see our PowerPoint presentation. You should also be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box and we'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. Just a context of the session today, both Phil and I are composers and we have experience of music education at different levels. I've primarily worked in secondary education and primary education, and Phil is working at tertiary level. But we both have a desire to see composition as an authentic experience in schools rather than something that might be taught in a formulaic way, which is something that has come up several times in examination reports for GCSE music. And today we wanted to reflect on a discussion Phil and I had with new undergraduate and second year composers at the Royal Academy recently. We wanted to explore what teaching composition is and what it can mean in a school context, suggest some resources that might help facilitate the teaching of composition, and consider the issue of feedback and external marking of composition. So the student voice session we had with the composition students at Royal Academy was really interesting. There was about 12 students there, and I gave them a series of questions that focused on: when did you know you wanted to be a composer? What support did you receive from school? What experiences did you have of new music when at school? Did you have your music performed? Did you know any other composers? Did you meet living composers at school? As we were very interested to discover their experiences of secondary education as people who had just left secondary education. And all the students brought very different backgrounds. Some had studied in the UK, some had studied in America, and some had been to specialist music schools, while some had been educated at state comprehensives, academies, or other educational establishments. It was really quite enlightening for both me and Phil to hear what the students had to say. Most strikingly, all the students mentioned there was a reluctance from their teachers to study composition at university. At least two of them had mentioned they had to apply in secret. They felt that feedback was rarely given on their compositions, particularly during the process of composing. They felt it was something they had to do secretly rather than share with their school music teachers. None of them had experienced music by living composers at school, and very few of them had their music performed live by other musicians other than themselves, perhaps writing a piece for piano that they performed in a school concert. It was even more interesting that all the students reported getting a less than satisfactory mark for their compositions at school. One student had a U grade for his composition, and there was an idea that to compose at A level you had to do something a little bit different to normal to make sure the examiner liked it, and this was something that their teacher had encouraged. They felt that they had to write music to satisfy a mark scheme rather than write music that they really wanted to write. But overall, the composition was something they pursued individually and something they received no ongoing support for from their teachers at school. It was really interesting to hear them talk about their beginnings as composers, and we asked them about how they got into composing, and all of them mentioned that improvising at an instrument was their starting point, and this was something encouraged by their instrumental teacher. One student mentioned that they weren't doing so well at learning the piano, and their piano teacher used composing as a way to make them practice even more. Some mentioned their parents encouraged composing at home, but no one mentioned their school music teacher had encouraged them to write music. Very few had support from their school music teacher to be a composer. It became something they did in private, and they didn't feel they could share their work with their school music teachers. The process of composition became something some teachers were not interested in, and they only were interested in seeing the final piece or the final coursework submission. Very few of the students had anything to say about their Key Stage 3 musical experiences. These were rarely mentioned, and one student mentioned their class was left to compose in a computer room with little guidance. But we were both greeted with silence when we opened the conversation about Key Stage 3 music. None of the students remembered doing any composing at that phase of their education. It's then that Phil and I, after our session with the students, we went to meet one of the composition teachers at the Royal Academy. And I wonder, Phil, would you like to introduce our teacher who kindly answered a few questions for us?
Yes, Chris Austin is a professor in the composition department, and he's a conductor and orchestrator who's worked on a huge range of contemporary classical music film scores. He had a Tony last year for his orchestration of American in Paris on Broadway. He's a hugely experienced orchestrator and conductor.
And we asked Chris about, can you teach composition? So we felt this is something that some students believe to be a subjective thing. Can we really teach someone how to be a composer? And Chris had some really interesting things to say, which we'll play you now.
You can help people with perception of themselves, perception of their reaction to other music, their perception of their own ideas, because that's one of the few things that somebody who is a little older or a lot older but more experienced can offer you, which is the thing that you can't see yourself, because when you're composing, or any form of musical creativity is like that. And in a way, a composition lesson is almost a bit like a highly creative form of scale practice, because the scale practice in the end is dealing with the DNA of tonal music, certainly, and even the fundamentals of acoustic instruments. There are ways of thinking that go beyond the localities of any individual style, I think. And the job of the teacher is to, with all the different students that you see over the years, is that ideally you're always teaching from, you begin from within what the student is bringing you, not just on the page, as the page that's presented to you, but everything as you get to know them better about their other experience in music, or their experience with cinema or literature or anything that interests them. And then to try to help them find a broader world that might just be around the corner. To engage in imaginative activity, and one that, if you're composing, you're spending so much time on your own and in your own head, and then the wonder of then collaborating with other people to realise that is a remarkable thing. And I think it doesn't matter it almost doesn't matter whether it's any good or not. It's actually, what does that mean? I know what it means, but it's actually how you get there, and how all of those things potentially change your perception of life in the most profound way. And
what I really liked about what Chris just said there was that it doesn't matter if it's any good or not. And I like how he emphasises the process of composition over the product. And I wondered, Phil, if what you're thinking was about how often should you have a lesson with one of your students as a composition teacher? Is it important to have something fairly regularly? Should we be meeting students every week? Or is it something that you'd leave a fairly long gap between sessions?
I think it's important to see students regularly, certainly every week, maybe no more than every week, because you don't want to get in the way. But it should be a regular event. I think if somebody's having problems writing, then it's really good to have a lesson. I know a lot of our students think that they shouldn't have a lesson if they have nothing to show, but that's, for me, the time you need to give somebody a lesson and try and help people over whatever problems they're having. And certainly when people are writing, it's good to show teachers what they're working on, get feedback, and it needs to be regular.
It's very challenging, I think, in a school context that we might have classes that could be fairly big. We might have 15 students, ideally in an A-level class perhaps. Some might have less, but having one classroom teacher that has to support those 15 students in the composition is quite a challenge.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of common problems, a lot of shared problems, and I think students can learn a lot from each other. So group lessons are very good, and we do actually have group lessons at the academy where we have 4 or 5 students and they share and show their work, and that can be in some ways more useful than individual lessons.
We wanted to share with you some approaches that we've used for teaching composition. Some have been used at teaching tertiary levels, some have been used with younger students, but to show some strategies that can be useful regardless of the syllabus you might be using, the specification you might be teaching, but approaches that help to cultivate a composer's brain, a composer's approach to dealing with writing music, including the idea of modelling, using the work of other composers and pre-existing music as a basis for writing new material, recomposing, using pre-existing material without any new material to devise new pieces, or perhaps restricting the variables, looking at ways of creating new music by focusing on a particular element or restricting pitch or other rhythmic material, for example. And one activity I've used to quite good effect with a wide range of students from year 4 to year 13 and adults is using a piece by Stravinsky as a model. Now this is a first from 3 pieces for string quartet. It's about 40 seconds long and there is no development in this piece. And I love using it because it's enough time for a very young student to get to grips with what's happening in the music. It doesn't change. The layers remain the same, so even a 10-year-old, I found, has enough time to discern the 4 distinct layers. And I've used this as a listening activity, and then by discussing with the class, what are these 4 layers, and being precise with exactly what the layers are. There is a folk tune, but we might also mention the restricted pitch range. We might then mention the ostinato, but the ostinato is irregular. We might mention the drone in the viola, which is also unusual because it has a less conventional timbre. And by being really precise about these layers, we create something of a prescription we can use to create a new piece of music. It seems formulaic, but the results can be quite strikingly different, even all starting with the same beginning. I'll just play the Stravinsky now. So here is the first from 3 pieces for string quartet. Now I'd like to play you 3 short examples of pieces that were created by adult students that used this model as a starting point for a new piece. Here's the first example. And here's a second one. And a final one. So it's interesting with the Stravinsky that they can all come up with quite different pieces, and it's a precision of that opening prescription of being very precise about what the 4 layers should be like, which enables students of any, quite a broad range of students actually, to create very different compositions. And it really helps them to have quite a concrete plan to begin. And it's similar by using a piece by Gabriel Jackson called September Corral. This is in the Associated Board Spectrum series. And I found this piece really useful for exploring the idea of timbre and texture. I give the students the piece, and as Gabriel Jackson writes at the bottom of the score, you can decide the tempo, you can decide the dynamic, as long as every bar is the same. I ignore those instructions and ask the students merely to use the pitch materials and devise a piece free of any of those constraints. And again, it's very interesting to see, once they're given material, however much of this material is just pitches, they have enough material to get on with writing something quite interesting. And it means they can focus on the process of composing rather than worrying about coming up with an idea. Another idea that seemed to work quite well with students to develop this composer's brain was a project I did with Procorder in 2013 and 2014. This involved working with all the students enrolled in their senior chamber music course. I worked with about 5 groups. Each group had 4 to 5 musicians in. They were jumbled up. They were different to the groups they were working with during the week, where they were learning chamber music by Beethoven, Debussy, Mozart. And I worked with them every day to devise a new piece of music, where the challenge was only to use material they were learning. It was a really interesting process of not using any new material, and the students could select extracts from their chamber music to combine with the extracts the others in the group brought to the table. We discussed a structure, and we discussed the character and kind of nature of our piece, but it was really interesting to see how the students' perception of the original chamber music changed by the process of experimenting with fragments from the music to devise something new. The final performance at the end of the week was really interesting for the parents as well, and the other staff, because we heard the original music in a new way through this process of recomposition. Here's an extract from one of the pieces.
I think, Steve, what's also interesting, just following on what you were just saying, is that the most difficult part of composing is always starting. And I think a lot of people think you have to have a really good idea or good material to start a piece. I don't think you always do. You can start a piece with anything, and sometimes giving people existing material or other people's material, and it's what you do with it that starts to make the music. So I think that's also important. Sometimes with students, you can give them something, and it's what they do. It's the next thing they do with the material. They put two ideas together. It's not about the starting point. It's what they do with something. Maybe people can share material.
Yeah, or a collaborative composition is quite a great way in the classroom to get students into composing, working as a team to devise something.
Yep.
And also there's some really good examples of composers and other musicians who have done recomposition. Christopher O'Reilly, an American pianist, has done a wonderful album of Radiohead transcriptions, taking the Radiohead songs and turning them into piano solo works. And Max Richter has also transformed Vivaldi's Four Seasons into something completely different, a reimagined version of the Four Seasons. And these are really inspiring for students to see that you don't have to come up with a new idea. You can take material and experiment and behave like a composer.
Berio wrote a set of duets for teacher and student violinists in the late 1970s. I think there's 34 of these miniatures. And as well as being wonderful pieces, they're fantastic miniatures to use as models for composing. Each piece just takes a few very simple ideas and turns into the most beautiful piece of music. And this piece, Camilla, is a really good model for writing a duet using a limited number of notes. And in this case, each of the two parts is arranged as a scale. You can see in the first violin how a very limited set of notes create a melody. And in the second violin, a very limited set of notes just on the D up to the A on the D string create an accompaniment. Through some very simple chromatic alterations, particularly on the notes E, F and B in this example, he just manages to flavour the music. And again, this is something that students could model. This is also a very good example of how to write a piece using repetition. Once you've heard the first few bars, there's really nothing else new in the piece. He just ever so slightly tweaks the same material and keeps repeating it. And one other thing that's quite noticeable in this example is how he sometimes just repeats a quaver with two semiquavers just to emphasize a note and just to push the music forward. So really small things can make a big difference. So we'll listen to this little piece called Camilla. So that there's the music up on the screen.
As the students mentioned at the beginning, they had very little exposure to music by living composers, and it wasn't until they came to the academy that they started to uncover music by composers that they could go meet and speak to. But there are plenty of resources available online and in print that can support you if you are quite keen to present to students music by living composers. NMC Records is a record label devoted to music, new music in the UK, and their website has a wonderful way of discovering composers that might have a similar sound to other composers, and also you can listen to samples of the tracks. NMC are working with Rheingold at the moment to produce a resource to support composing in the classroom as part of an online music classroom that will be launched this autumn. The Associated Board Spectrum series is a really fantastic collection of pieces by living composers, most of them are playable by young musicians of varying levels of experience. Some can be played by students that might have only been learning an instrument for a few months, while others might require more experienced players. But it gives chance for students to engage with a variety of compositional approaches, as well as discovering music that has been composed more recently.
And Contemporary Music for All is an organisation that's been going for about 20 years. They have a fabulous website. I think it's coma.org. And on the website, they have an online library where you can look at scores, pieces that are scored for any combination of instruments and are very, very flexible. And again, there's about 1,000 of these pieces, and they're just fabulous examples of different ways of composing, different approaches people can take, and you can listen to extracts of pieces on their website and browse the music online. That's a fabulous resource that's available. Again, some of these pieces could be good models in the classroom.
Coma also has ensembles that exist all over the country that you would be able to join as a teacher. And I used to play in Coma South near Southampton about 10 years ago, and I found it a really interesting experience working on composition with other musicians. And they always had really peculiar starting points. They might be pieces using kitchen utensils, they might be pieces using interesting photographs, but it really made me as a teacher think creatively. And I think it's quite important, if we're going to teach composition and facilitate composition, we need to behave like composers ourselves as teachers. And any opportunities to do that, I think we should embrace. And I wonder, Phil, what do you think about being a composition teacher? Do you think it's important that you're actively engaged in composition?
Definitely. I think all people capable of writing music, and maybe teachers should, when they set their students tasks, maybe they should do the same task at the same time. I think to teach composition, it's good to compose yourself and have hands-on experience of what the issues are and what the stumbling blocks are and how exciting it can be.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I know when I've done NSET courses for teachers, when I've made the teachers do the activities, they've often said, now I know what the students feel like when I give them class activities like that, because we know it's really quite scary to be creative. And particularly in a classroom situation where we're under pressure to get through a lesson, we're under pressure to get through lots of activities, we can sometimes not give students enough time to be creative. And it's good for us to experience that as teachers by, as Phil suggests, having a go at the activities that we give our students. And finally, getting towards the beginnings of secondary education and composition at Key Stage 3, it's interesting how all the students said in our student voice session at the Academy that doodling, experimenting and improvisation were all really essential ways they got into behaving like a composer. And I think it's really valuable as school teachers that we encourage these activities and we provide opportunities and space for our students to indulge in doodling, experimenting and improvisation. It's very easy for composition to become formulaic and for us to give... Fun. Yeah, it needs to be fun, and that's exactly what Chris said earlier, but it needs to be the right kind of fun. And I think encouraging these activities free of right and wrong is a really great way to encourage students at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 2 to get involved as behaving as a composer. There was some press last December about A-level music marking being a bit of a lottery, and it was really striking to speak to the Academy first and second years, and they all mentioned that they had a problem with one of their A-level marks for composition. One would assume that students who would be going to Royal Academy of Music would all be getting an A for their composition, but they didn't. And I wonder whether, should we be considering composition at A-level as a very different activity to that composers do in the profession? Is the activity of composing at A-level more about manipulating musical elements to satisfy a brief, and that we have to manipulate several musical elements? And is this something that's different to composing beyond in the real world? I mean, where is the problem? Is it the marking criteria? Is it the nature of the coursework brief? I wonder, Phil, did you, after you've interviewed students, obviously for Royal Academy as undergraduates, where do you feel the problem might be or could be with this A-level composition? Do you think it is the marking, or is it the nature of the tasks they have to do?
I think it must be the nature of the tasks they're given, and I also suspect that people don't quite know what they're looking for in somebody's music, because obviously you don't know what you're going to get because you don't know what people are going to write. So it's hard to pigeonhole, which I suspect is what the exam syllabuses are trying to do. They're trying to make students create a certain product, if you like, which kind of kills off composing before you've even started.
I think also that A-level music isn't ideally just about preparing musicians to study at university. It's also the end of their education at school, so it's important that the activities they do at A-level are open to a wide variety of musical traditions, styles and experience. So I can understand perhaps why these briefs are so useful for some boards, but it's just very interesting that some students perform less expectedly well than we would hope in A-level composition, particularly those who would be successful at competitions or achieving a place at conservatoire. Mark schemes are really difficult to make sense of. Can we really define what imagination looks like in an activity like composition that is so varied? We're going to see so much variety in terms of what students are going to produce. Structure seems to be a really key assessment criteria, and I always advise students to pay considerable attention to how they organise their musical ideas if they're going to be successful. But I have noticed with all these mark schemes, regardless of the specification, regardless of whether it's GCSE or A-level, that students really are expected to manipulate more than one musical element, while there might be composers, such as Stravinsky, that don't manipulate an array of musical elements in their music all the time, and perhaps they wouldn't score so well at A-level. We need to encourage students to manipulate a range of musical elements so they can achieve as well as we'd like them to.
I think they also need to, in the best way, be economical and be very inventive with a small amount of material, and show how much they can get from a very limited number of ideas.
And I think that's why the Spectrum series by Associated Board is so useful, because the pieces are so short, composers had to think really carefully about every pitch they've used, every rhythm, every dynamic marking to get the most out of a very limited amount of material. And just to summarise our short session today, before we take any questions, just to reflect back on what the students told us at the beginning, they all felt they weren't given enough feedback while they were composing, and they wanted that feedback. They wanted to feel able to show their music to a teacher free of judgment and to get more advice during the process. They all mentioned that no living composers featured in their research and preparation phase of composing. It would be fantastic if students saw more music by living composers and even meet a living composer, because there are plenty to meet. And schools often have an author visit, they might have a poet come, they might have an artist visit, but do they have composers coming to schools? Are there opportunities for your students to have their music played by someone else? And it's a very different experience than playing the music yourself. And I don't know if Phil can remember the first piece he had played, but I remember the first time I heard one of my pieces played. And it's quite a peculiar experience because it's the first time something that's been living in your head is being heard by other people. I'm not sure, Phil, if you remember your first experience.
It's very exciting. You need that element of excitement and that character as well to inspire you.
Yeah, so I hope, regardless of the level, that more students get a chance to hear their music. And I think it's great if someone else plays it, because it's great to be able to stand back and reflect on what's been living in your brain for months and months and months. So we'd like to take some questions. And I'll start off. We've got Helen's asked a really interesting question. Are there any visual, printed, online resources that you would recommend for young composers at the Key Stage 2 level, which could help them to organise or structure their work? I would say the Spectrum series is really useful for this, particularly the second book. The second book, I think all the pieces are 1 page long. It's got some music by Phil in there as well.
Yeah.
And I think by looking at a piece of music that's 1 page long, even students of fairly limited experience of music and notation particularly are able to look at it visually and notice when ideas come back, notice when ideas are changed, notice contrasting material. It's a bit like exploring a sculpture where you can walk around it, you can touch it, you can feel it. And I think students looking at 1 page pieces enables them to perceive the whole. if they just listen to a very long piece, maybe a 10-minute long piece, they might not be able to perceive the structure of it. By looking at a short piece, beginning musicians can start to understand how to organise their material.
And I'm sure there's some of the spectrum pieces that they'll be able to play as well, some of the easier spectrum pieces. And they maybe improvise, as some of our students at the Academy have been saying. They would play pieces and improvise and develop those pieces into their own music. So spectrum the spectrum books are a fabulous starting point as models and as actual pieces that you can play around with and experiment with.
And a really interesting point by Julia. She said she's interested in the discussion today about teachers being composers themselves, and she's wondered do we see enough of this in Key Stage 3 classrooms at the moment? And I wonder, I suppose I can't speak for every school, but I certainly feel when I'm teaching students and doing composition, whether it's in year 4, year 13, year 10, that I'm behaving like a composer myself. I'm thinking through what the student might do next. So I think teachers should give ourselves credit, but we have to behave like composers all the time when we're teaching composition. We have to try and perceive what might come up next. As Chris Austin said earlier, that it's about having that increased perception of possibility and about where a student might take an idea, what music might be a useful model, what music might inspire them and how they might organise their material. So, I mean, it'd be fantastic if there were a coma ensemble for teachers where teachers can get together and compose and used to being creative like that rather than fearing composition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sarah's asked, how would you go about teaching composition to students who struggle with the concept of notation without resorting to graphic scores? I don't know what your thoughts on this are, Phil, but I suppose I would always suggest they start with their instrument and the instrument they play. So rather than send them to a piano, that perhaps they might not play the piano, but if they play the bagpipes, the mandolin, the guitar, they go to something that enables them to express their ideas in sound before they worry about notating it. I'm not sure what you...
Yeah, well, maybe they could record themselves playing the pieces they're writing, and then maybe they could multi-track and then build the piece up in layers on a computer through recording, cutting and pasting, layering, playback and recording live, and just playing around with the recorded sound. So the actual business of chopping around and editing something on a computer becomes part of the compositional process. You don't have to notate a piece.
And you don't have to notate it for A-level. Depending on the board, you can submit screenshots and a discussion of how the piece was devised or put together. So for students who struggle with the concept of notation, there is still the opportunity to submit a composition in a different way. Oh, that's great. There's lots of interesting questions. Interesting one from Rebecca. She made a point about we need to encourage our pupils to not be afraid of failing, and that's a really, really good point. And I really like what Chris Austin said about how it doesn't matter if it's any good. And I think we need to get rid of this idea of good and bad in composing. I mean, it might be the case in an oral test that it might be right and wrong, but in composing we need to remove this idea.
There's no right or wrong.
There's no right or wrong.
And often it's very liberating to throw stuff out and start again. It can be as positive as pursuing an idea. Yeah, you just need to remember there's no right and there's no wrong.
An interesting one Rebecca mentions, what programs would we recommend for those with a very limited budget? There are cloud-based notation software now. Obviously, Sibelius can be quite expensive. There are educational discounts, but you might have a look at Noteflight, which is quite good because it's cloud-based. You can get it via Music First Classroom, which is a product available from Music Sales, and it has a license fee per number of users, and it's quite inexpensive, but being cloud-based means that students can use it at home and they can carry on projects at home. So it's quite a good way to look. It's quite a good program to use in the classroom. And there's another one called Soundation, which is a sequencer, which is quite useful, inexpensive again, but also cloud-based. So it means that students can carry on work on beyond the classroom. There's one here from Bernard. He's working with some great students, and time again they come unstuck for being too subtle and too sophisticated. And he's not sure what the solution is. I'm not sure we have the answer here either. But I can certainly understand that there is that pressure for students and from their parents as well as the students to get top marks, and it can be difficult to maintain a creative approach when dealing with A-level coursework. It seems easier for top performers to get top performance marks than it is for great composers to achieve top composition marks. I think I would agree with you there, and certainly that was our experience when we spoke to the students.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I came to me recently was that people often spend years, by the time they've got to A-level, learning an instrument. They might have been learning their violin, their bagpipes or their mandolin for 7 or 8 years. Well, as a composer, they might have only started composing as an individual at GCSE, and then they might have only written 2 pieces at GCSE, so their experience is far limited compared to their performance experience, where they might have learned 30 pieces. And so maybe we need to be thinking about giving more opportunity for people to write more music earlier in their education, so by the time they get to GCSE and A-level, they're slightly more experienced, and they don't just have this, 2 pieces they've done before they get to A-level, and this might help them start to achieve better marks. So we can allow them to be creative without feeling there's that pressure to jump through hoops to get really great marks. Oh, lots of questions, which is fantastic. And Lindsay's mentioned she's just started looking at keywords and composition skills with her year 10s. She did do group composition at Key Stage 3, but how would we go about encouraging the reluctant composer when they don't have confidence composing individually?
Maybe to go back to something I was talking about before, maybe people could share ideas. So an individual, people swap ideas. So somebody isn't starting off with an idea that's their own, so they don't have the worry of whether it's any good or not. So maybe people could create some material and then pass it around to somebody else in their class, and they could take something along the next step, and not have the worry of whether the actual idea is good, because it's not their idea, it's what they do with it. That's important.
And it's just like using the September Corral from Spectrum, that the students don't have to worry about what notes to choose. All they have to worry about is what instrument's going to play it, how they're going to play it, what the sound is like, and that's what composing is all about. It's not just about coming up with this great idea, it's about using material and devising ideas over time. Margaret asks, how can composition be taught in a context where the students have no previous music theory knowledge or only play instruments by ear?
Well, the first thought is they could maybe improvise. They play instruments by ear, and again, you could record improvisations, then listen to improvisations, and take parts of improvisations, specific parts, and then maybe play those again live and develop them. So you work through a process of improvising and recording and listening back, and then taking the next step, whatever that might be from listening to what you've improvised.
And I guess also it's thinking about structure and working with the students to explore how they can create contrasting ideas all by ear, and how they might have ideas come back and how those ideas might transform, and how they can experiment with their instruments by looking at different sound, different timbres, different dynamics, less conventional playing techniques. And it's a great way to do it in a way, because composition should be about sound rather than only about writing things down. What about music composed on Logic or GarageBand that is not actually playable live? How do you argue its value to an exam board, asks Soren. I don't know what Phil would say about this. I suppose the kind of method of realising a composition is inconsequential, really. You can still judge a composition on its merits in terms of how the material's been organised, what the composer's done with the musical ideas, and how they've made a really interesting experience over a span of time. So whether they did that in GarageBand, whether they did that in Logic, whether they did that with pen and paper or Sibelius, it doesn't matter. What's important is how they've organised their ideas over time that's made a convincing whole, and something interesting to listen to and memorable. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that.
Lots of great questions. Let's have a look. We've got a great one from... Let's just move down. We've got lots of great questions. Elizabeth asks, how do you suggest teaching composition Key Stage 3 so that students all experience success when not doing project work? And she suggests teachers short studies. I think that's a great idea. It's good to do short exercises. I suppose you want a balance. You want the chance for students to come up, do very quick pieces, maybe perhaps in one lesson, but at the same time, they need to develop that skill of working over a longer period of time and that depth. And also the idea that they can keep refining an idea. I suppose there's a danger in the classroom that we give students not enough time to do a compositional exercise. They might devise a piece and then we move on to something else. Well, do we spend enough time by going over that piece? Do we give them a chance to do it again? Do we give them a chance to do it again and again? And I think that's the process of composing, is that we keep refining our ideas and keep improving them.
So you could get your students to write tiny little miniatures very quickly, and then the next stage of the process could be getting them to work out an order that they put all the miniatures into a longer span through repetition or developing miniatures or writing links between the miniatures. So they each write one part of a larger piece and decide how they're going to organise it.
And Claire asks, how would you recommend a student develops a song they have written with fairly basic chords but with catchy, well-written lyrics over the top? That, I think if we all knew how to do that, we'd be millionaires.
One thing they could try doing is transposing the chord and then going back to the original and inserting some of the transposed chords instead of staying in the same key. And again, realising there's absolutely no rules.
Yeah, that's true. And I think in the mark schemes, you'll see they do expect with harmony that you do more than perhaps the tonic and the dominant chord. So if they do have basic chords, they might consider extensions of the triads. They might consider adding other non-harmony notes to help make it sound a little bit more exciting.
Or give them some restrictions.
Or some restrictions, yeah. And Simone asks, do you think an introduction to composition based on homage approach, which recognises devices used by composers, or homage approach, which recognises devices used by composers could generate ideas? I suppose I think Simone's referring to the idea of looking at composition devices perhaps like sequences, pedal notes, and I suppose these do have a place because these are the kind of things we want our students to be able to recognise in unfamiliar music, because these are the listening skills we're developing at GCSE and A-level. Whether or not an overemphasis on these devices might stifle creativity, I don't know what Phil might do. Do you think if we just teach our students devices, are they going to create rather stilted music, or is it important that we give them these kind of underpinning?
Well, it's good to give people somewhere to start, and then as long as we don't keep going back and doing that and we let them at some point move on from the starting point, that can be creative. But I suppose what they need is the confidence to do that.
If there's any more questions, we're very welcome to have them in the next minute or so, because I think we've answered. It's really interesting questions.
Yeah.
And it shows that this is a big thing for all of us as teachers in the classroom, is getting this balance right between teaching in a formulaic way and giving our students lots of tools and approaches they can use, while at the same time encouraging creativity and facilitating individuality. But I think Phil and I are both trying to say that we don't want them to avoid using models and using inspiration from other pieces of music as a way of getting them into composition. They don't have to worry about having that brilliant idea at the beginning. Elizabeth mentions, we open with the aim of authenticity. However, when looking at high school and GCSE sample compositions from exam boards, they often appear to be a checklist for devices and not sounding like an engaging piece of music. And what do we think about that?
Sounds horrendous.
It sounds horrendous. And I think we both agree there is that danger when we look at sample things and we look at mark schemes that they turn into a checklist for things we need to stick into a composition so our students get problem solving. I think it's something that, and I hope this is something that Music Excellence London might do, is that get teachers together to talk about what these mark schemes really mean for us as teachers in the classroom, to find ways of teaching our students composition in a way that allows them to be authentic, creative, without trying to tick boxes too much. But we do have to look at these mark schemes, and we do want to make sure that students have access to the best grade without putting a ceiling on what they could do. So I think it's a bad thing in a way. And it is hard to find sample compositions. It's hard to give a number of compositions that will be indicative of what you might see, because there's a real broad spectrum of composition. Even at GCSE, when I've marked that, you see so much variety of possibility that it will be hard to give one sample of a high composition. You'd need hundreds. You need hundreds of them. And Sarah asks, how would we go about teaching composition to non-musicians? Everyone's a musician, I think, but especially when they struggle to see the point.
I think ask them maybe to bring in a piece of music they absolutely love, and use that as a starting point. As you were talking earlier, Stephen, about people reinventing existing pieces, maybe they can do something with a piece of music that they do see the point of. Reinventing it in some way, or taking an element of it and rearranging it, or taking it somewhere new.
That's a really good idea, and I found when I've worked with new GCSE students, I've always asked them to bring music in that they like, and it's interesting how when students feel that you acknowledge their musical tastes, which can be very different to our own, and they might like music that we don't particularly enjoy ourselves, but I think once they feel like they've been heard and they think, okay, my teacher really is interested in what I like, they might start to see the point of composition a bit more, because they'll understand that it's about taking our own inspirations. As Chris said earlier, it's about our perceptions of the world, not just our perceptions of music that we bring to our composing. And by allowing students to use their experiences, they might start to see the point of composition as a way of responding to the music they enjoy and love. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Phil as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. They were really interesting, and I hope your academic year goes really well with lots of interesting composition, but thank you for joining us this afternoon.